Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching this LTC, and I am so close to finishing my series on lists for every single faction in Warcry. They keep adding new ones, right? I can almost taste it. So let's get into it. This is Order, the second half. Now, we're mostly going to cover all the elves today, but we do need to start with the one chamber of Stormcast that we didn't quite get to in the last video. A little bit like the other chambers, some of the highlights and lowlights here are pretty similar. There are so many options for Warrior Chamber because Liberators each come with a million different loadouts. There's all three flavors of Paladins. There's a whole bunch of different loadouts for Prosecutors and Judicators. And then there's 15,000 different heroes, most of whom are not my favorite, to be honest. A lot of these options are playable too. As far as like heroes, you can play a Lord Celestin or a Lord Relictor if you want to. Liberators are perfectly usable in a few of their different flavors. All the Move 3 Paladins are usable. The Judicators are really interesting. One Prosecutor can be a pretty good choice as well. So there's so many things in Warrior Chamber that don't suck. And it's really amazing. They also have an excellent double where if you're within 6 inches of a friendly fighter who has been injured, basically has taken some damage, you can just get a free move on a double. And this is really interesting because you don't have to end closer to your buddy than you started. So you can just use this to get anywhere on the board. And it really helps them out, and it really helps out especially some of their slow options to kind of get around the board a little bit better, especially something like Decimators and Protectors who are slow, but they have that 2-inch and the 3-inch range. So their threat range is pretty good, even though they are slow. And so getting that free double can often get you those 2 attacks in one round with them, which is just so crucial for Stormcast for actually managing to clear the board. Their lowlights are kind of the standard Stormcast Eternal numbers issues where they don't have any chaff. So there are a lot of missions where they're having a real struggle scoring points, and a lot of missions where maybe numbers don't matter for scoring points, but numbers do matter for like activations and timing things correctly. You will never get to dictate the terms of engagement with Stormcast, which can be tough. But they are just so good at winning their fights and not dying and just being just generally a nuisance on the board. There's so few things that can one-shot kill a Stormcast, and these the move 3, like toughness 6 and 7 Paladins, basically nothing one-shot kills them, and so you have a chance in every fight. In my last video, I kind of called Stormcast Thunderstrike sort of a classic pub stomp faction, because, and this is true of the other chambers as well, where every time I do a tier list and I put Stormcast not very high, I usually end up putting Warrior Chamber and Thunderstrike, maybe high B, in B tier, and then the others are in C or D. And I always get comments like, I crush all my friends with Stormcast. What are you talking about? They're incredible. And it's more that in casual play against lists that aren't necessarily tuned to win missions, to, lists that are like, here are some of my guys and they do some cool stuff, but they aren't necessarily like, I'm here to score the most points on the missions that are most likely to exist in Warcry competitive play, right? Those are two different modes. And Stormcast really clean up against unfocused warbands because they're so hard to kill. They all do kind of respectable, not actually as nice as I would want to damage, but they all do respectable damage. They're all really tough to kill. And there are things you can do with them that are quite powerful. That's kind of why I call them pub stompy, and they really struggle in competitive play. Now, Warrior Chamber has real competitive options that maybe the others don't. And that's not a bad thing, right? It's not a crime to be powerful, but not top tier, which is where Warrior Chamber is. They're basically just a faction with a lot of really strong, really powerful options that just have matchup problems among like the other powerful factions, right? The really powerful move 3 chaff swarm factions are just they're just swamping the board, and Stormcast can't overcome the activations and the number of bodies they have to kill. The really crazy like Brugit combo lists, they manage to finally clear the hurdle of how to take down a Stormcast efficiently. And so that presents this whole other problem with Stormcast, where if the opponent's big thing is big enough that it doesn't fear a Stormcast, then all of a sudden you're just like your whole plan falls apart with Stormcast. So Stormcast are very powerful if built well. Stormcast Warrior Chamber is absolutely that. I'm going to show you some pretty good options, but just know that if you are wanting to like go win tournaments, you're going to have matchup problems against the lists that are currently winning tournaments, but that doesn't mean that it's not extremely powerful, and in many cases like overwhelmingly good in casual play. So let's get into some lists. And the first one I wanted to do is like a pretty wild warrior soup list. So starting with a Retributor Prime. Now this one's a little dangerous because it's got the 1-inch move, but I don't mind it so much on the Prime because you're not as worried about using the dice to kind of accelerate it and use that extra free move on a double. Then 2 Paladins with Starsoul Mace, Skaith, Khaine, Shiok, Khaine. This is the Skaith's Wild Hunt Underworlds team, and they're great. Skaith is movement 8, can throw his javelin 8 inches, is kind of tougher to kill than he should be, using the old algorithm that doesn't necessarily total sidebar on Underworlds. So many of them use the 1.0 points distributions, and so things like Khaine, Shiok, Khaine, and Skaith, they're all fast. They are a lot cheaper than fast things are in this edition, which make them great for Stormcast. The Starblood Stalkers are the same because Stormcast are slow and they're expensive. And so if you can bring something in that is fast and cheap, that really balances them out really nicely and really helps them to cover the board. So then this list also, I have here an Old Guard. You could do a number of different things with what ally you wanted to bring in there. The Old Guard can cast Swift as the Wind, which is a really nice ability from Tempest Sai. This list has basically 3 little titans. The Retributor Prime and the 2 Paladins with Starsoul Mace are, tough to kill. That they have that toughness 6, and they just do a ton of damage when they're sort of in combat. And so you have this ability to be really flexible on the board with Skaith's Wild Hunt, and then come in with your Paladins maybe in later rounds and really clean up once they've caught up to the action. So there's a lot to really like here, and this list is pretty cool. Plus 8 fighters in a Stormcast warband is just a wonderful place to be. Here's some other things you can do with Stormcast Warriors. The first is Pure Warriors. Now, in Warrior Chamber, you can't count to 7 fighters without 2 Gryph-hounds, which are terrible, unless you do just the box of Liberators, which is actually a pretty solid budget way to get into the game. I would say it's maybe not as budget friendly as, say, getting the Vindictor box for Thunderstrike Chamber, but you get way more options in terms of loadouts, so that can be something you like. So this, if you're going to go down to 6 fighters with Stormcast, you're going to be in trouble in some missions, but in others, you're going to be okay as long as you pick just really powerful fighters that have reach and can terrify anything on the board. And so that's why here I've gone with a Decimator Prime. You're getting that extra inch of range along with a regular Decimator. And then Adjudicator with Boltstorm Crossbow. Those do a shocking amount of damage at range. That 4-4-2-4 profile might not seem that impressive if it were on a melee fighter that was that price, but on a ranged fighter who can just stand and shoot twice on anything on the board, it's really incredible. Then you have the Prosecutor with 2 hammers. This one, you get a lot for what you pay. Now, it is only 20 wounds for 220 points, and it has to get into combat a lot of the time, so that can be a little dangerous, but you just have all of that ability to chase things down, go get a treasure, stuff like that, and then you've actually got a reasonable ranged attack on it too. Then just filling out with 2 Liberators with Sword and Shield. These have that toughness 6, which is just really nice for Liberators, and they don't do a lot of damage, but they do enough that they can't be ignored, which is what you want. Another way to kind of run a 6 model Stormcast force is if you bring in a KO ally, you can focus on more Judicators because the Etheric Navigator can cast Fight for Profit, which will then give your Judicators +2 attacks if it's on an objective or holding a treasure. And so now those Judicators can really blow stuff off the board and do some really impressive stuff, which is really great and generally something you want to do. Also, this list fits in a Paladin with Star Soul Mace, which are just incredible in combat. One of the most points efficient fighters in the entire game. So there's a lot you can do here if you're willing to go down to 6 fighters. Just make sure that anytime you do that in Stormcast that you are bringing absolutely terrifying stuff. You really want to avoid, like, Stormcast has a lot of kind of clever support heroes, and those can be really good allies in other factions, or they can be worthwhile if you've already got 7 fighters and you're not necessarily worried about numbers. But support heroes, I've said this in a couple other videos, but defensive elites are not playable in elite lists because you have fewer numbers, so you have to clear the opponent's board off of the table in order to score any points. The same is not true in, say, a really chaff-heavy faction. So all these Stormcast, and there's so many, every chamber has like 12 of these like Stormcast support heroes, various priests and wizards and castellans, etc., that are completely unplayable in Stormcast, even though they're kind of good in a vacuum. Those really are just like relegated to the ally bin for other factions. You can't really play them in Stormcast. So just make sure that if you're running 6 fighters in Stormcast, that all of them are offensive, all of them are scary, and can kind of comfortably go get in the opponent's face. Now let's get into Idoneth Deepkin. They're like all elves, they're in kind of an odd spot. The highlight is the Achillean King. I've played some Idoneth Deepkin lately, and the Achillean King often keeps the game close all by itself just because it's carrying the whole fight on its own. And at 305 points, you would hope that it would, but it really does succeed in its job. And its ability, it's on a double Storm of Blows, is really impressive in game. The other thing that's okay is the bespoke soul render in Underworlds. Back when it came out, this is Elethane's Soul Raid. Elethane is a soul render, like this picture I've got here on the board. And back when it came out, it was just a worse version of the soul render that was already out. But that was when Idoneth Deepkin in 1.0 were a legit competitive force and were one of the scarier factions in the game. Things have really changed. All of the points algorithms have changed to really punish elves quite a bit. They just made all elves terrible. And so the Underworld's factions that use those old algorithms are often the best ones to save your elves. And so this guy who was once just like a slightly worse version of Idoneth's sort of main disruption hero is now easily the second best fighter in Idoneth Deepkin. The lowlights, one is that the crab is really bad. The crab is just like probably double the points that it's worth. If they repointed all the Underworld's warbands now, crab would be really good, but right now it's terrible. Every fighter in Idoneth Deepkin, other than Elethane and the Achillean King, is not playable in a competitive environment, which is too bad. And a lot of them are not playable in casual environments either. Now, to be fair, eels are really close to being okay. They're just a little overcosted. I've been playing them 2 eels in my narrative list lately, and they're reasonable in casual play. Here's the list I've been playing in narrative. A Kellyan King. I've been using Divine Blessing, so a mighty Ishlan Guard. It's not particularly powerful this way, but it is just a way to use up your points. Then a regular Ishlan Guard and 4 Namarti Thralls. The Thralls are tough to use. I'm just going to say that. They have 2-inch range, so they're not like completely dead in the water like a lot of elves are, like almost all the Cities of Sigmar elves are, like a lot of the Daughters of Khaine elves are. They have that 2-inch reach so that they can at least stay a little bit out of your opponent's reach. But man, when something gets into them, that those 8 wounds for 80 points, it's just so much of your army to lose to just like one attack step from your opponent. So you have to be extremely careful with Thralls, and even if you are careful, they're still not very powerful, which is just a tough place to be. But like I said, the Kellyan King often will just carry this whole group, and I've actually gotten some play out of Biovoltaic Barrier. I've been able to get like an Ishlan Guard to tank a brew-gated up Mega Boss because I had Biovoltaic Barrier going. And so the Mega Boss just like counting to 20 when you have to slog through that ability is just really, really difficult to do with just one attack step. So they are nice. They have real play to them, and they're just not efficient enough for competitive play. But in casuals, you can use them. This list is absolutely functional because, you have these 3 move 10 fighters that can go wherever they want on the board. You have the 2-inch reach to at least keep your Thralls out of danger if you're really careful with them, but it's not very powerful. Going into some other stuff with them, if you don't want to just be locked into Kings and Eels, I would get Elethane Ill-Fated. That's from the Underworlds team, and he comes with Fuiran and Spinefin that are also pretty good. Fuiran is like a Kellyan Thrall almost. He's an Kellyan, but he's kitted out like a Namarti Thrall, and he's just like a little bit more elite than a Thrall is. But he still moves 5, and he's kind of an interesting piece. He's a little bit mid-rangey, right? He's not great for competitive play. You couldn't use him, but he is like an acceptable sort of amount of value you're getting for your points. And then Spinefin is really fun. Spinefin is just like a little fish that swims around really, really fast, dies if you touch it, but for 80 points for like just one activator who can run around the board and do things, score points. That's a pretty reasonable thing to have, especially in a situation like this where you're not really bringing the Kellyan King for that like big dragon to have on the board. After that, I really think if you're not running an Kellyan King, you need allies in Idoneth. So I would go with a Protector Prime and a Kurnoth Huntmaster with Sword. Those are just going to be 2 nice heavy hitters to really help out the main problem with Idoneth, where you just everything you have just falls apart in combat, right? And so now you have this fun situation here where your Protector Prime has 3-inch reach and your Thralls are all on 2-inch reach, and Elethane Ill-Fated has his net and then he has 3-inch reach. So you can really lock things down and then wail on them without them being able to hit you back, which is really, really nice to be able to do. So it's a fun little combo that you can run. And then the Huntmaster with Sword doesn't fall into that, but man, there's always a few different fights on the board, right? So it can get into a fight somewhere else and it's going to survive a few rounds and, deal some real damage. So it's kind of this set it and forget it piece that when you're kind of comboing off with the rest of your list, you want to be able to have something out there that's kind of working on its own and not needing the combos to function. Let's get into Daughters of Khaine. And before I do, if you've been enjoying this series, please hit a like or a subscribe. I've realized that I almost never do that in my videos, and you're really supposed to. You're not supposed to forget. And if you're interested and you want to kind of chat about these lists with me a little bit more in a way that I can respond to a little bit more easily, consider joining my Patreon. I'll link it down below. I link it in every video, but I pretty much never talk about it. Something that convinced me to talk about it a little bit more was that a person who told me that they were like a longtime fan of the channel legitimately did not know that I had a Patreon, despite having watched like most of my videos from the last year. So I should probably mention it more. So if you do want to chat, I kind of struggle. I get a lot of questions about, various Warcry things, and I struggle to sort of respond to all of them. I get, like people hit me up through Discord or through Reddit or, in the comments, and there's a lot to respond to. So I do prioritize things that come through the Patreon. So if you like these videos, consider supporting me in a few different ways there. So let's get into Daughters of Khaine. And the main highlight, they're a little bit like Idoneth Deepkin. The Bloodwrack Medusa is still good. Now, it did take a 20-point nerf from first edition. It was insane in first edition. It was one of the best fighters in the game, but the extra 20 points made her just kind of decent instead of crazy good, which is a perfectly fine and good place to be. But as an ally, she's been really successful throughout second edition. Not like a meta-dominating piece, but just like here and there, you see people doing really well with Bloodwrack Medusas. The other highlight for Daughters of Khaine, yes, all their units are bad, but they do have a lot of them. So you have a lot of ways to at least kind of explore and maybe if you're more of a Johnny type of player and you don't worry about winning, you have a lot of different modes of self-expression here, which is great. And of course, the low light side to that is that basically every single unit in Daughters of Khaine, other than the Bloodwrack Medusa, is really struggling. The Gore guy is sort of okay. The Gore guy being the melee snake leader from the just regular Blood Sisters. That one can, do some damage, but at 255 points, there's kind of other better things you can be doing. So they're just in a really rough space. And it's tough because the units that are struggling for like completely different reasons and in different ways, right? Like snakes, they suicide into counter too much. And so for how much they cost, they're kind of unplayable in kind of a wider environment. Whereas, maybe the smaller elves, they also suicide into counter, but also at only 8 wounds and like witch elves being 8 wounds, 1-inch range, they just blow up. And they're in this interesting situation where like they're stronger than a ghoul, which ghouls from Flesh Eater Courts are 55-point fighters that are pretty good because they have a really good reaction. And yes, they're move 5, 8 wounds like a Daughter of Khaine would be, but they only cost 55 points, and so they are really focused in on the things that are effective, which is just they can go score points, they can be really cheap, and then their reaction is really good for keeping them alive. And Daughters of Khaine have none of that because at only 10 points more, that really skews your efficiency because now you need these witch elves to do damage, and they can't survive long enough to do any damage because they have to get in within 1 inch. It's a really interesting thing. I hear so many AOS content creators talk about how points adjustments don't matter. And there are lots of good reasons why that's true in AOS, right? Because most of your power is in your allegiance abilities. It's in your battle tactics. It's in all of these extra things beyond what your fighters actually do. But in Warcry, the dice ability system, pretty low impact compared to just what's on the fighter cards for each fighter. And so points matter a lot. Even just like a 10% change one way or the other in points can really, really change a fighter's power level in the game, just because there's not that much else going on in the game. So that's kind of where we're at. All of their abilities are a little bit disappointing, other than, of course, Bloodwrack Stare on the Bloodwrack Medusa is incredible. But they have these issues where, for example, let's look at Slaughter's strength. I've put that in the bottom corner of the screen right here. Until the end of the fighter's activation, add half the value of this ability to the strength. And in practice, that maths out to being about as valuable as Onslaught is. But Onslaught's a universal double that every single faction gets to use. And Daughters of Khaine don't use Onslaught very well because they have lots of low impact attacks. So adding one more attack is pretty garbage for them. But this, is better for Daughters of Khaine than Onslaught would be, but it's worse than Onslaught is for most factions. So it is worse than Onslaught. And it's a triple, whereas Onslaught is a double. So it's just a really embarrassing situation to be in if you're a Daughters of Khaine lover, because it's like we have to pay more than every faction in the game does for a damage buff that is less effective than what every faction in the game gets, including us, but we can't use the damage buff that every faction gets. So it's an awful place to be. Every strength buff in all of Warcry is bad, which is really too bad. But let's kind of dig into what are our tools, because if I were a game designer from GW right now watching this video, I'd be like, this guy's an idiot. We gave you the things to deal with this. We gave you multiple strength buffs. We gave you, lots of different things that you can do. So let's get into it and see what we can do. So the first is Daughters of Khaine have an ability called Bathe in Blood. A fighter can only use this ability if they're within 3 inches of a visible enemy fighter with 1 or more damage points allocated to them. And until the end of the fighter's activation, you get +1 attack and +1 strength. So it has a really difficult, it's difficult to put it anywhere, but it isn't difficult to eventually trigger somewhere. But it has an ability that you have to jump through a hoop to use, but then it's just a more powerful onslaught. So that's great, right? The problem is we have to be able to know we're triggering it when we want to, because one problem with Daughters of Khaine is you run up to something, you attack it, and if it's a little thing, it counters and you do more damage to yourself than you did to it. Or if it's a big thing, it just goes, okay, and then once you're done attacking, it kills you, right? So we need to make sure that they've taken damage before they attack us, right? And so you could do the archers that are in Daughters of Khaine, but the archers in Daughters of Khaine are awful and unplayable, so we can't use those tools. So we look elsewhere, right? One way to do it is a Quester Prime. This was the Quester Soulsworn, the leader of the Quester Soulsworn, who recently came out this past summer. The Quester Prime can deal 3 damage to everything within 3 inches of it, and it does it on a triple. And you can do that early in the match. Like you could just move 4 double move 8, and then pop this for a triple and get quite a few things in the bubble. And that can be nice because if you do that, say in round 1, then you can unlock Bathe in Blood for future turns, which can be really helpful. It also has Thundering Strides, which gives a bonus move to a friendly fighter. So you can use that on, say, your Gore guy here. You can use that on a Blood Sister. You can use that even on the Hag Queen if you wanted to have a few kind of higher impact fighters who can benefit from getting an extra move. And Gore guys and Blood Sisters move 7 inches, so you're getting a lot of movement when you do that. So that can be really nice. The other thing is that Hag Queens have Witch Brew that can pump the strength of a friendly fighter at a little bit better deal than the awful Slaughter's strength here. And so you're kind of giving yourself a lot of different opportunities to try to get your strength up a little bit so that you don't just get blown off the board by counter. If I were Games Workshop, I'd be really mad that nobody is trying this with Daughters of Khaine. People have essentially just given up on this faction completely. I don't think this list is all that powerful. I do think this is better than anything that you can do with Daughters of Khaine that doesn't have a Bloodrack Medusa. However, I don't think this is good. I think it would be okay in casual play, and that would be as far as I would go with it. But if you are really into Daughters of Khaine and you want to kind of try to figure out a way around some of their issues, this would be a place to start because you just have a lot of different combos here at your fingertips to try to mitigate this issue that any single any warband with more than 8 fighters, you just die the second you get into combat with them, because they just counter you off the board, and then their one big thing kills all your stuff. This really legitimately is trying to fight that. I kind of had to dig really far into their abilities to figure out which pieces were designed to mitigate this problem. And the tools are there. They're just not very good. So here you are. Another option you could do, though, is to only play good fighters. Bloodwrack Medusas are really good. Gore guys are okay. And then you would just have to bring in an ally. So here I've got a Protector Prime with the 3-inch reach. These 4-fighter kind of meme lists, they can be completely unplayable in some situations and then completely overwhelming and powerful in others. So as long as you're not playing like a ton of objective missions, a list like this can actually do some work, because those Medusas has 7-inch threat range, and so does the Gore guy, and the Protector Prime, has that double that it can get the free move, and it's got the 3-inch reach. And so you can really bully one part of the board really effectively. And also anything that you stare down with the Medusa, everything here has over 2-inch reach or 2-inch reach or better. So you can really destroy stuff. If you wanted to be less meme and pure Daughters of Khaine, you could do 3 Witch Elves instead of the Protector Prime, which would be a more pure list, and you just have more activations, so that could work for some people. Now let's get into Lumineth Realmlords. The one elf faction that's kind of doing okay. They have a lot of abilities that mitigate the elf problem. So, for example, Wardens can give -1 attack against their opponents in a bubble around them. So you can actually set it up with Wardens, then move the Warden, and you move the -1 attack bubble. You have to be within 2 inches of like other Wardens to use the ability, but then once you've done it, you can move twice and put the bubble somewhere else. So they can protect each other and themselves and other elves that aren't part of the shield wall as well, which is really nice. Stone Guard also have a nice little defensive ability. So you have a lot of ways to mitigate that elf problem. Also, Stone Guard they're only move 3, but they've got that 2-inch reach that is really nice to have on move 3 fighters. And they also have 12 wounds instead of 8. So they have a little bit more durability. At 85 points, 12 wounds is totally acceptable. And so that's just a much better situation to be in as an elf. So Lumineth kind of have much better tools to survive than IDK and Daughters of Khaine and the Cities of Sigmar elves do, which is great. They also just have lots of cool abilities that aren't necessarily all competitive, but they are really sweet and great build around abilities, whether it's Sharp-Eyed Scryhawk, where you pick something out and your whole team gets +1 attack on it, or whether it's the Cenari Caligrave is one that I like, where you can just pick a point on the battlefield and everything around that point, your opponents get -1 crit damage, so you can AoE debuff an area that isn't just around the Caligrave, which gives you a lot more flexibility for using it. Things like that. Just lots of really sweet casual abilities. The issues that Lumineth have are, one, their leaders are not very impactful, even the ones that are pointed to be really impactful. So things like the Venari Lord Regent or the Steed Master are not as scary as I would like 200 and 225 point leaders to be. You look at a Lord Regent, and then you look at a mega boss, and then you look back at the Lord Regent, and it's like, you are not a mega boss. You know what I mean? And they're the same points cost, by the way. And so that can be a little bit of a disadvantage, but that's not really the kind of game Lumineth is looking to play anyway, so I get why they did it that way. The other real disadvantage for Lumineth is because all of their ways to mitigate the elf problem are all like ability focused or sort of range focused, like Wardens have that 3-inch range, Stone Guard have 2-inch range. A bad initiative roll will just ruin you. So you can be, and we have a local player. He's really, really good. Shout outs to you, Matt. He's really, really smart about how he positions his Lumineth. He's really good with them. He wins more than he loses, but sometimes, like I've had the experience playing against him where he's winning, but I'm like keeping it really close. And then all of a sudden, like we'll be going into round 3 and we'll roll, and I'll be looking at my dice and I'll just hear him go, fuck. And I'll look up and be like, what? And it's like, he's looking at his dice and he's looking at the board and he's like just realizing like there's no possible way for me to set up my like safety castle before that you can pick it all apart. And so all of a sudden I've gone from winning to totally losing here. And that can just happen with Lumineth Realmlords. So you have to be willing to live that life. In any given game, right? There's usually 2 pivotal rounds and where your initiative roll is really going to matter. And there's like, for each of those rounds, there's like a 20% chance that your dice are going to totally screw you over. You're going to have a bad initiative roll and your opponent's going to pick you apart. But if you can kind of keep the house of cards going, Lumineth are really good. I just wanted to mention here, Blade Lords, Sentinels, Wind Chargers are not good. And it's kind of sad. 1 Blade Lord could be okay because they have the 2-inch reach and they can be used to proc the Warden -1 attack bubble. So you can't have a bunch of Blade Lords, but you can have 1 in a crowd of Wardens and it works out pretty well. So let's go pure Lumineth here. And I'm going to go with a Steedmaster because you want something that can sort of move around the board and at least do some damage, and the Steedmaster does that. Then 5 Wardens here. So I'm really looking to kind of build these -1 attack bubbles against my opponent. I've got my 1 Blade Lord who can hide in the bubble. I've actually got 2 here. The other one is Island, the Mind's Edge. She's a better Blade Lord that costs less. Again, this is an artifact of Underworlds, but she is just an Underworlds fighter who is solid. She was worse than Blade Lords when she came out, but Blade Lords have since been nerfed a little bit, and so now Island is better than them, which is really funny. So I have Island and a Blade Lord here to kind of sit in the attack bubbles, or in the -1 attack bubbles, and use attack from within them. Then I've got 3 Stone Guard here that can be their own little separate pack, and you can be smart about your deployment groups, and you can look at the missions and decide, I'm going to put my Stone Guard where there is the least movement that has to happen, and they can get into action quickly. You could also, if you don't want to go track down Mayari's Purifiers, you can make Island a True Stone Seneschal. Arguably, the True Stone Seneschal is better anyway. They're move 3. They've got a lot of really good efficiency that GW has given to a lot of move 3 fighters, and so they're pretty solid. And at 105 points, I think they're a very reasonable replacement for Island. You'll just be, like I said before in the highlights and lowlights, you'll need to be really, really careful. You'll need to put everyone in the right deployment groups for the missions you plan to face. You're going to need to be really careful with your positioning to get your defensive castles working every single round. Warcry is so hard for castling because you have to rebuild your castle every round. You have to make sure at the beginning of the round you start in a castle. Then you have to move the pieces of your castle one at a time so your castle breaks apart, but you really need to reform it again by the end of the round, which is like a lot of pressure. It's really, really, really difficult to play, but it is effective. If you can put it together, it is effective. So this list is very powerful, totally capable of doing well in tournaments, but it's really hard to play. So just be aware that it's really, really hard to play. If you want to kind of maximize your stone, guys, that can be a little bit more of a forgiving playstyle to play with Lumineth Realmlords. Their defensive ability is a little bit easier because you don't have to build a castle to use it. And they really appreciate Kixitaka, and that is the Seraphon Underworld's leader. Now, Sarah, a lot of people complain when I just am posting soup list after soup list, but at least Seraphon have legitimate reasons to be allied with Lumineth. They're the 2 Order magic armies. Or I guess there's 3 because Stormcast Sacrosanct are in the same boat, but they're 2 of the 3 like order magic forces. And so it just makes a lot of sense that they'd be allied. So I think that works well. And then Kixitaka gives +1 move and +1 toughness. And Stone Guard at being 3 move and 4 toughness really love going up to 4 move and 5 toughness. That like completely changes the game for them. And so you can kind of get them into position that way. And then, you can either have Kixitaka to help make them more defensive, or you have their own ability to help them be more defensive. And then I've just added a Kurnoth Huntmaster with Scythe here to give you like I love having a heavy hitter who can just be set it and forget it in a lot of situations. And the Huntmaster with Scythe is sort of your best option for that in order as far as just being a very heavy hitter. Certainly the Stormcast heroes do a little bit better at maybe being really points efficient, but the Huntmaster is just bigger and that can be pretty good. And also, let's be honest, I looked at doing either an Annihilator Prime or a Protector Prime, but the points didn't fit well. So this list, you've got your 5 Stone Guard. They are very efficient damage dealers. And then Otapodal is really nice for giving you that flexibility, moving around, shooting things. The Caligrave is another piece to make it harder to kill your fighters by, plunking down a little spot where your opponent gets -1 crit. Now, if you've got, if you can ever get this to happen where you've got +1 toughness from Kixitaka and you've got -1 opposing crit damage from Caligrave. So now they hit you on fewer things and crits deal less damage. They are just not hurting you, right? That is going to be an incredible situation to be in. But again, we have gone back to this kind of Lumineth thing of like, this is a house of cards. You've got to do a ton of stuff, but at least you've got a lot more points efficiency here to work with. So it's going to be a lot easier to pull it off and a little bit more forgiving when you don't. You don't have to take my word for it. I know 2-1 is like, you're either 1 dice roll away from being like undefeated champion of a tournament, or it's like 1 dice roll from actually having been 1 and 2. So if you weren't there, it's really difficult to say, but people have tried lists like what I've been talking about, right? This is a list that someone did really well with in Spain. They only lost to Hrothgorn Ogres in the finals. And I think Lumineth in general doesn't want to see ranged warbands because you can pick them off without necessarily being in their defensive bubbles. But they have a True Stone and 4 Stone Guard. They have 2 Wardens. They have an Old Guard. They have a Thundercat Prime with Stave. I mean, this is just so similar in a lot of the sort of build philosophies to what I've got over here. And they did pretty well with it. So if you can figure out a way to solve artillery with Lumineth where, them being able to attack from outside your -1 attack bubbles, then you're going to be really, really cooking. And I think that this list is good. I think this is a nice proof of concept to show that like a lot of these Lumineth concepts I've shown here are powerful. Other people have done all right with Lumineth in the past, but you don't really see it a lot in events. And I wonder, maybe it's because they're so hard to play. Maybe, it's because they're so hard to paint. I don't know. They're pretty popular in AOS despite being so hard to paint and so hard to play. But, maybe it's like if you're obsessive enough to get into it, then you're the personality type to be into Big Hammer anyway. Tough to say. So now we'll get away from Elves for a second and let's do Seraphon. A lot of cool things about Seraphon. So abilities are really key and really nice for the faction. They have some really cool synergy between the reaction, which is Starborn, which turns crits into hits and really, really reduces the amount of incoming damage on a lot of different fighter types because there's so many sort of crit fishing things in Warcry, even among like the high strength, high impact attacks. A lot of them are like 4-8 and turning those 8s into 4s can really help keep your guys alive. Then you've got Tearing Bite. So a given Saurus, almost all of their damage output is on just 1 attack from their triple. And so every Saurus is a really legit counterpuncher because you can just use the reaction, not take as much damage, and now you're still around, and now you Tearing Bite them, and that's almost all your damage anyway, coming just from that ability. And so you have this ability to kind of play offense and defense at the same time with Saurus, and that's really, really nice. So a nice little package that you get to play with Seraphon. That's great. But they have good abilities elsewhere too. Nimble Retreat for skinks, free disengages are pretty good. Hunting Pack to get free attacks from your artillery pieces. Lords of Space and Time, which lets you teleport things around with your Slann Starmaster. All of these are pretty solid, which is really nice. They also have an excellent Underworlds team. You have seen me use them as allies in a bunch of lists on this video. Honestly, I'm starting to think that Underworlds are not good for the game, because basically this Underworlds team cancels out all of the drawbacks from the point change in 2nd edition. So when 2nd edition came along, they really nerfed fast fighters. I'd say they over-nerfed fast fighters, if I'm being honest. And they really nerfed shooty fighters, which was very necessary. And the problem is, with Underworlds back in the game, it's almost like they didn't nerf any of those things. If you have the right Underworlds team, you can just bring those back in. And so it kind of turns the game into a bit of a mess if everyone's just got Underworlds fighters from the old algorithm coming in, because they didn't power creep the game. They actually made the game less powerful overall in 2nd edition. And it was a good thing. It vastly improved the game. But it does mean that bringing in fighters from the more powerful points algorithm in 1st edition is just like really, really good. So it's kind of silly. But either way, Seraphon are one of the halves as far as that goes. So you should absolutely, if you like Seraphon, grab some Starblood Stalkers and go to town. Lowlights for Seraphon, there's not that many. I mean, skinks are not good, but you can always just bring in the Starblood Stalkers, and those have skinks on the old algorithm when skinks were one of the best things in the game. But if I'm sort of being nitpicky, their smalls are not that small, and their talls are not that tall. This is something that I've kind of mentioned in a few videos, but Warcry, and I guess I mentioned at the top with Stormcast Eternals, but Warcry is often about you lose because either their biggest thing was bigger than your biggest thing, or you lose because their smallest things were like overwhelming your smallest things on numbers, right? Those are sort of two of the common ways to lose in Warcry. And Seraphon don't necessarily play in either of those spaces. Now, their abilities are good enough to overcome that, which is great. But you just need to be aware that, you're playing closer to the middle than a lot of other factions. So let's do something crazy with Seraphon. And I thought I would do this nice little tribute to the Matthew McConaughey, Christian Bale. Man, what a garbage movie this was. I saw it when I was a kid. Really hard because these are two incredible actors, but either way, yeah. Reign of Fire. I wanted to have a Slann Starmaster, which I'll explain in a minute. 3 skink handlers, 2 salamanders, 2 Saurus warriors with clubs, and Otapodle, who is a chameleon skink. You can use any chameleon skink you want to proxy Otapodle if you want. And this probably isn't the most competitive way to do this concept, right? You're probably better off turbocharging Razordons because they can shoot a little bit farther, and they have a less powerful shot, but it is more consistent with their 5-3-1-3. But salamanders are cool, and this new model, the Spawn of Chotek, looks like a salamander. It doesn't look like a Razordon. Now, you can't get salamanders or Razordons. Let's be honest, Seraphon is kind of an unplayable mess right now if you are trying to get into it. All the base sizes for the new models are different than the old models. Half the old models don't exist anymore, but the Warcry roster is all based on the old models, so things like the Spawn of Chotek aren't there. Things like the Slann Starmaster used to be on a much smaller base. Now this giant, big, chonky one is like as big as small monsters. It's really a mess. But the models are so sweet. We've got to use them, right? So if I were TOing, I would let someone use a Spawn of Chotek as a salamander, even though the base is probably triple the size of a salamander base. So check with your TOs or just use old salamanders. What's cool here is we're getting around the lower range of the salamander by having the Slann Starmaster available to teleport them around the board, which is cool. So you can, if your opponent is hiding from the salamander, you can teleport it to where it can see the thing it wants to shoot with the Slann Starmaster. And then your skink handlers are fast, right? So they can always just catch up to cast pack tactics or pack hunters on your salamanders. So you can kind of teleport the salamander across the board and then run your skinks up to catch up to it. And it can be pretty effective that way. And that way you can get 3 shots per salamander for the one that's being teleported. The other one also will get 3 shots, but you won't get to teleport it first. So that's a really powerful way to get around the drawback of salamanders. Still probably not as strong as Razordons, but way cooler. And I mean, come on, who doesn't want to just like spit flames at all of their opponents? I think that's so cool. The Slann Starmaster also has a really nice ranged, bit of a tickle in the throat here, ranged attack. 12 inches and 3 dice instead of 2 just makes it a lot better than the sort of standard wizard that you get in Warcry. A more Saurus heavy list could look a little bit like this, with a Saurus Scarvet on Cold One, a Saurus Sunblood. Sunbloods are no longer on the website. This is what I mean by like the Warcry roster and what GW is actually selling for Seraphon are like completely different things. But then you'd have Kixitaka, 3 Saurus Warriors with clubs, Zepik, Otapodal, and Tok. The Starblood Stalkers give you kind of the flexibility you need and the speed you need to then be able to set up good counterpunches with your Saurus, because you can prioritize activating the Stalkers at first, kind of picking things off with Otapodal and Tok's shooting, and going and scoring points with Zepik, things like that. Proccing Kixitaka's sort of +1 toughness buff that can come in. That's another one, much like what I talked about in the Lumineth section. Kixitaka giving you +1 toughness, and then your reaction nerfing crits means like your opponent's total damage is constricted in 2 directions, which is better than just constricting it in one. Basically, they don't step on each other's toes. They're not buffs that necessarily reduce each other's effectiveness. They actually increase each other's effectiveness. So really cool. And then, the Scarvet is one of the better Tearing Bite users. Sunbloods are great, and they don't need Tearing Bite to succeed. Lots of really cool options you can do with this list, and a lot of play to it that's really awesome. Seraphon have, often done pretty well in the hands of careful players, and so I think this is something that you could do pretty well with as well. Let's go to Sylvaneth, and they're going to be our last faction for today. We'll have finished order other than the bespoke factions. You'll be able to see this video in a sort of long playlist on my channel of all of the sort of starter list videos, so that you can kind of look up any Grand Alliance or faction that you want. Highlights for Sylvaneth: they have a fighter for every role, and I think that's really cool. So they have Chaff with real abilities, right? Tree Revs can teleport. Spite Revs have nets. They have a great underworld team with a bunch of Chaff that, like, Khaine has a +1 attack bubble around him, or like Khaine is just really, really fast because he's a cat. Their Chaff have real use in the game other than just being bodies, which is really nice and a really nice place to be, especially if you enjoy kind of sort of heady play. They also have decent heavy hitters. Kurnoth Huntmasters have a lot of wounds, can do real damage. That's pretty nice. They are not as good as what Chaos and Destruction can bring to the table, as far as, what a Huntmaster can do versus what an Ogre can do, what a Orc can do, what a Fomo Crusher or Ogroid can do, right? So That's kind of an order problem in general. That's not necessarily just a Sylvaneth problem. Sylvaneth's version of a heavy hitter is better than anybody else's in order, other than Stormcast on efficiency, and that's kind of just true in general of Sylvaneth, where they have every single role, but none of it really impresses you as far as point for point efficiency, and so that's going to be kind of an uphill climb in a lot of situations against really tuned competitive lists. Now, against most opponents, that won't necessarily be true. At your local game store, that won't necessarily be true. But, if you're in the later rounds of a tournament, that is going to be just like an uphill climb a little bit. But you do have really solid abilities that on your chaff that certainly can mitigate that. You have those nets on the spite revs that can slow down opponents, things like that. Shiok from the Underworlds team is 70 points and incredibly points efficient. So that is one little exception. But, a 70-point fighter who's worth 80 points is like not necessarily going to completely change your day. They also have a lot of bad leaders that are traps, things like branch witches, stuff like that. You can just safely ignore those. Let's get into getting our Lorax on. Here's a list: a Huntmaster, a Hunter with Scythe, 2 Tree Revenants, 4 Spite Revenants, and 2 Dryads. So the Spite Revenants, of course, this is the classic. You net something and then you attack it from 2 inches away with your Huntmasters with Scythe. A tale as old as time in Warcry. Really, Sylvaneth is good at it, better at it than most factions. 2 Dryads are there because at a certain point, you've only got so many dice. So why, you don't need more Tree Revenants and more Spite Revenants when you just don't have enough dice for them all. So you may as well take the extra point of movement to get around the board easier, switch between objectives easier, things like that. And if you do expect to play a lot of objectives, Sylvaneth can really do that. They can handle like a Rumble Pack tournament really well, because you could just drop the Kurnoth Hunter with Scythe and then just go really hard on Revenants and Dryads. Maybe even bring in Khaine for just like pumping up your chaff to be able to beat their chaff in a fight, stuff like that. So Sylvaneth can really do well with a very similar list to this in an all objective mission, or they can do something in sort of a situation where you might see objective missions, you might see kill missions. You can bring a list like this and be pure Sylvaneth and be in a reasonable place where you have a lot of play and a lot of interesting abilities. This has been kind of a theme of the back half of this video is, Lumineth into Seraphon into Sylvaneth all being these like very careful, tricksy, ability-oriented factions. Seraphon, like those other two, are very difficult to play, but maybe a little bit more straightforward, actually, in that what a net does. You root something in place. What a teleport does. You get out here and put it over there. So there's a lot of kind of constraining opponents' positioning, unlocking new things with your own positioning that you can do with Sylvaneth, and it's pretty cool. You could also drop a Spite Rev and a Dryad for Tree Revenants to have more teleporters, and that would let you turn this Kurnoth Hunter with Scythe into a Stormcast Eternals hero, which might give you a little bit more points efficiency if you're interested in that, because that can be one of the kind of tough things for Sylvaneth. We can get kind of weird and cool with Sylvaneth, though, and I think that Calthea Zandire fits really, really well with them. So if you have, say, a Kurnoth Huntmaster with Sword, and then Calthea Zandire, and then like 2 Kurnoth Hunters, I think it fits points-wise to do 1 with Scythe, 1 with Sword, and then 2 Spite Revenants for your nets, and then a Tree Rev. I played a similar list to this once, but instead of Revenants, I had Dryads because I don't own any Spite Revenants. And it seemed really promising. I felt at the end like if I had Spite Revenants instead of Dryads, I would have been really onto something here. And the reason is because Calthea, she's of course great at, moving her fellow Stormcast around the board. She has this ability called Coordinated Strike, where she gets to pick, up to 3, depending on the dice roll, fighters who can each make a bonus move or a bonus attack, right? And so there's sort of proven success using her in Stormcast, accelerating Annihilators around the board. But accelerating a Kurnoth Hunter around the board is actually more exciting than an Annihilator. Now, Annihilators are so points efficient, right? You're kind of taking these 130, 145 point fighters that are actually worth 140 and 150. Kurnoth Hunters are 170 points and they're worth 170, but they are bigger and higher impact than Annihilators at the end of the day. And so getting free activations with them, with Calthea, is more powerful, right? You're, instead of just moving 3, you're moving 4. That Scythe, you are often being able to just stand still with it, and then she's sort of pumping it to attack again no matter what. A lot of real power that you can get here, and moving those Huntmasters and the Hunters around the board just feels incredibly powerful with Calthea. So I think you'll have just a really good time with it. I only tested it once, but it seemed pretty promising and worth tinkering with. That's all I've got for Order. That's every faction in Order other than, the 2 second edition bespoke factions. I will be getting into the last bespoke factions. I've done all of the first edition bespokes, so I'll do the second edition bespokes next, and I'm really excited for that. It'll be coming, in the next probably month or so. I'll have this whole thing finished, and it's been a long saga. Slowed down a little because I had a kiddo, but we're almost to the end, and I'm excited to have sort of all of this recorded, and then I'm sure as soon as I finish, GW will give us our long-awaited balance pass, and all the lists will be obsolete. That's just how it goes. But for now, I have more plans for more Warcry videos in the future, and until then, may all your rolls be crits.